The first time Karen Shipley tried to have my dogs put down, I smiled. It was the kind of tight, thin smile you learn in Army CID when a suspect is lying through their teeth. A smile that promises a very specific, very methodical kind of ruin. She saw it, her perfectly coiffed silver hair seeming to vibrate with indignation, but she didn't understand it. Not yet. She just saw a man who wasn't afraid of her, and in the manicured, whisper-quiet kingdom of Whisperwood Estates, that was a declaration of war. That smile was the beginning of an HOA scandal that would expose a conspiracy of illegal foreclosures and end with her empire in flames. Where are you watching from? Comment your city. I want to see how far this kind of HOA power reaches. But the real beginning, the moment the first tremor shook the foundation of my quiet life, wasn't in a sunlit HOA meeting. It was in the dead of night, at 3:17 a.m. to be exact. The sound wasn't a knock. It was a single authoritative boom that vibrated through the floorboards of my grandmother's old house, rattling the teacups she'd left on the mantelpiece. In the ink-black dark of my bedroom, I was instantly awake, every nerve ending firing. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat in the sudden ringing silence. Then a second sound, far more chilling. The low, guttural growl of 120 pounds of honed muscle and protective instinct. That was Atlas, my Belgian Malinois, his body a coiled spring of tension at the foot of my bed. A moment later, a deeper, rumbling growl joined his from the hallway. Nix, his sister, a sleek Dutch shepherd, was already at her post by the front door. My feet hit the cold hardwood floor without a sound, a ghost in my own home. My past life, the one spent hunting predators of the two-legged variety, had hardwired a certain economy of motion into my soul. I bypassed the light switch, my eyes already adjusted to the slivers of moonlight filtering through the tall pines that crowded the property. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and pine needles, a smell that had always meant peace. Tonight it smelled of invasion. I moved to the front door, my hand resting lightly on Nix's head, her muscles quivering beneath my palm. She didn't bark. Neither did Atlas. They were trained for this, for the silent, patient wait before the storm. I leaned in, pressing my eye to the peephole, the cold metal a shock against my skin. What I saw made the blood freeze in my veins. A distorted fisheye image of Karen Shipley, her face a mask of incandescent rage, was illuminated by the weak porch light. In her hand, she held a ring of keys, jiggling them with furious impatience. Then she did something that defied all logic. She raised her foot, clad in a ridiculously sensible orthopedic loafer, and kicked my front door. The wood shuddered, and this time the dogs exploded. It wasn't the yapping of a startled pet. It was the deep, chest-cleaving roar of professional canines, a sound that promised evisceration. Through the peephole, I saw Karen stumble back, her face draining of color, her mouth forming a perfect O of shock. She hadn't expected the resistance. She hadn't expected the dogs. And as she fumbled with her keys again, trying to find the one she believed was her right, her master key, I knew this wasn't just an HOA dispute anymore. This was a siege, and Karen Shipley had just kicked the wrong damn door. If you've ever been bullied by an HOA, you're going to love this ending. Stick with me. It all started 6 months earlier, with the wind chimes. I'd just moved back to the Blue Ridge Mountains of North Carolina after my honorable discharge. The house wasn't just a house, it was the last piece of my grandmother I had left. A sprawling, 2-story craftsman nestled on a double lot, built long before the concept of a homeowners association, was a twinkle in some power-tripping busybody's eye. The air here tasted of clean water and wood smoke. The cicadas provided the evening's soundtrack. It was my sanctuary. I spent the first month just breathing, letting the quiet seep into the cracks of a soul worn down by years of investigating the worst of humanity. I was decompressing, with only Atlas and Nix for company, my partners from my final tour, retired out with me. The first letter arrived in a crisp, cream-colored envelope, the Whisperwood Estates logo embossed in gold at the top. It was a violation notice. Aesthetic nuisance. Unapproved auditory annoyance. My grandmother's wind chimes, a gift from my grandfather 50 years ago, were deemed a problem. I remember standing on the porch, the soft metallic tang of an approaching rainstorm in the air, reading the letter as the chimes played their gentle, random melody. It felt like a desecration. I took them down, not wanting a fight, and placed them in the attic next to her old cedar chest, which smelled faintly of lavender and memories. That was my first mistake. It showed weakness. A week later, I met Karen Shipley in person. She was doing her morning patrol, a clipboard clutched to her chest like a ballistic plate. She was a woman in her late 50s, with a ramrod-straight posture that seemed to defy the slight limp in her left leg. Her silver blazer was immaculate, her pearl earrings perfectly centered. She stopped at the edge of my property line, her eyes scanning my lawn with the predatory focus of a hawk. "Mr. Thorne," she called out, her voice carrying an unnerving blend of southern charm and surgical steel. I was on the porch, sipping a glass of sweet tea, the condensation cold and slick against my palm. The dogs were lying in a patch of sun, their ears perked. "Ma'am," I said, not moving. "I'm Karen Shipley, president of the HOA," she announced, as if presenting her credentials to a foreign dignitary. "I just wanted to formally welcome you and remind you that the lawn maintenance standards require a cut every 7 days. Yours is approaching 8. She tapped a perfectly manicured finger on her clipboard. The grass was maybe 4 inches high. "This wasn't just my fight, it's yours too. Tell me if your HOA has ever crossed the line." "I'll get to it," I said, my voice flat. Her eyes flicked from me to the dogs and back again. A faint, unpleasant tightening appeared around her lips. "The bylaws are quite clear about pets as well. 2 is the maximum, and they must be leashed at all times when not in a secure, approved enclosure." Her gaze drifted pointedly to my sprawling, unfenced yard. It was a yard my grandfather had deliberately kept open, believing fences were for prisons, not homes. That was the spark. The fence. For the dog's safety and my own peace of mind, I decided to install one. Not a cheap chain link, but a handsome 6-foot privacy fence made of good North Carolina cedar. I submitted the plans as required. They were denied. "Material not in keeping with the aesthetic harmony of the community," the letter stated. The approved materials were white vinyl and ornamental aluminum, both of which I despised. I checked the thick, unread tome of the HOA bylaws my grandmother had left in a drawer. There it was in black and white. Article 4, Section 2A. Any property constructed before the establishment of the HOA in 1995 was grandfathered and exempt from architectural and material mandates, provided any new construction was structurally sound and not a public nuisance. My house was built in 1968. This was the first real piece of intel, the first chink in her armor. Holding that knowledge felt like chambering a round. I resubmitted my plan, this time with a polite one-sentence cover letter referencing the specific bylaw. "What would you have done in my place?" "Drop it in the comments." Her response was not a letter. It was another visit, this time with a man from the Architectural Review Committee in tow. He carried a measuring tape. Karen stood with her arms crossed, the morning sun glinting off her earrings, as this poor man nervously measured the distance from my proposed fence line to the road. The air was thick with the smell of her cloying lavender perfume, a scent that was quickly becoming synonymous with dread. "This is harassment, Karen," I said, my voice low and even. I stood on my porch, Atlas at my side, a low growl just barely audible in his chest. "It's due diligence, Mr. Thorne," she shot back, her smile not reaching her cold, calculating eyes. "We need to ensure your grandfathered structure doesn't infringe on community easements." Her use of air quotes around grandfathered was a deliberate jab, a signal that she considered my legal standing a mere suggestion. The committee lackey finished his measurements, mumbling something about it being fine. He practically scurried back to his golf cart, leaving me alone with her. The tension was a physical thing, a pressure in the air. Cicadas buzzed in the oak trees, a frantic rising crescendo. "Your dogs are a menace," she said suddenly, dropping all pretense of procedural nonsense. "They're military dogs, aren't they? Aggressive, unstable, they don't belong in a family community." The insult was so profound, so deeply ignorant, it left me momentarily speechless. These dogs had saved lives. They had comforted soldiers in their darkest hours. They were more stable than she could ever hope to be. "They're my family," I finally said, the words like chips of ice. "We'll see about that," she said, turning on her heel. The finality in her voice was a threat, cold and clear. The battle lines were no longer about fences or grass. She was coming for my dogs. She was coming for my family. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my grandmother's worn leather armchair, the house dark and silent around me, and I did what I was trained to do. I started to dig. I pulled out the mountain of HOA documents again. The original covenants, the amendments, the meeting minutes going back a decade. I read every single line. My fingers traced the faded ink on old papers, the smell of aging pulp filling the quiet room. I was looking for leverage, for a weakness, for anything, and then I found it. It was in an amendment from 2008, passed in an emergency session with only 3 board members present, one of whom was Karen's husband. The clause was titled Emergency Welfare and Maintenance Access. It granted the HOA board president a master key to all properties for the purpose of addressing immediate safety hazards, such as fires or burst pipes, or to perform exterior maintenance if a homeowner was unresponsive. It was an obscene, illegal overreach of power, a clear violation of property rights that would never hold up in court. But it was there on paper. And it meant she believed she had the legal right to enter my property, to enter my home. The realization hit me like a physical blow. The air in my lungs turned to ice. She wasn't just a bully with a clipboard. She was a woman who had armed herself with a key to my front door. I immediately changed the locks, replacing the standard deadbolt with a high-security, pick-proof, bump-proof model. It was a small act of defiance, a hardening of the perimeter. For the next 2 weeks, an uneasy quiet settled. No letters, no visits. I built my cedar fence myself, board by board. The clean, sharp scent of the fresh-cut wood was a defiant perfume against her lavender. The physical labor was a balm, a way to channel the cold rage simmering just beneath my surface. I knew she was watching. I could feel her eyes on me from her own perfectly manicured house across the green. The silence was the run-up to the assault. I was treating it like a tactical operation, anticipating her next move. But I never anticipated the sheer audacity of a 3 a.m. attack, which brings us back to the splintering wood and the sound of roaring dogs. Back to the distorted image of Karen Shipley in my peephole, her face a grotesque mask of fury and shock. She was trying the old key, the one that now fit nothing. It scraped uselessly against the new lock. Then she tried the new key from the ring, the one she must have assumed was the master. It didn't even slide in. The click, click, click of the key failing was drowned out by the barking of Atlas and Nix. Boom! The second kick was harder, born of pure frustration. It was the kick of a tyrant whose absolute power had just been checked by a simple piece of brass and steel. I watched, my heart pounding a steady, furious rhythm now, as she raised her foot for a 3rd time. She was actually trying to kick my door in. This HOA president, this pillar of the community, at 3 a.m. I stepped back from the door, my mind racing through protocols and consequences. I gave Nix a quiet command, and the barking stopped instantly, replaced by a silence that was somehow more menacing. Atlas followed her lead. The sudden quiet on my side of the door seemed to unnerve Karen more than the noise. She paused, her foot hovering. I could hear her ragged breathing. She leaned closer, trying to peer through the peephole herself, her eye a monstrous, disembodied orb in my viewer. And that's when I flipped the porch light switch I'd had specially installed inside, flooding her in a brilliant, merciless glare. She cried out, stumbling back, one hand flying up to shield her eyes. She was exposed. She was caught. And she had no idea that behind the door, my phone was already recording, and my 2 K9s were waiting for a single word from me. The war had just come to my doorstep, and I was about to open the door and greet it. With my phone recording video from my chest pocket, I twisted the deadbolt. The sound, a heavy, definitive thunk, was a punctuation mark on the end of her failed siege. I pulled the door inward, not wide, but just enough to create a 4-inch gap. I filled that gap, my body a solid wall, my face unreadable. Atlas and Nick stood silently at my heels, perfectly disciplined, their presence a palpable wave of energy that rolled out onto the porch. The smell of the damp night air, mixed with the acrid scent of ozone from the hot floodlight, washed over me. Karen Shipley looked pathetic. Caught in the spotlight, her face was a mess of shock and fury. Her silver hair was slightly askew, and a smudge of panicked lipstick was now on her cheek. The clipboard, her symbol of authority, lay forgotten on the welcome mat. For a split second, I saw past the HOA tyrant and saw a startled older woman, her chest heaving. It was a flicker of vulnerability, a crack in the armor, and it was gone as quickly as it appeared. Her shock hardened back into her default state of righteous indignation. "What is the meaning of this?" she hissed, her voice a strained whisper, trying to regain control. "Your animals? They could have broken through the door." "They don't break things, Karen. They're trained," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "The question is, what's the meaning of this? It's 3 a.m., you're trespassing, and you just attempted to force entry into my home. That's not an HOA violation. That's a felony." I let the word hang in the air between us, as heavy as a body bag. Her eyes darted from my face to the sliver of darkness behind me where the dogs waited, then back again. Fear was finally starting to penetrate her rage. "There was a noise complaint," she stammered, the lie clumsy and transparent. "I was performing a welfare check, as is my right under the Emergency Access Bylaw. There is no bylaw that allows you to kick in a resident's door in the middle of the night. You know it, and I know it." I raised my phone slightly, ensuring the screen's glow was visible. "And this entire exchange, including your little temper tantrum, is being recorded. So, I suggest you get off my property before I call the sheriff and show him the evidence of your late-night house call. This illegal harassment ends now." She stared at the phone, then at me, her mind clearly racing, trying to find a new angle of attack. Defeated for the moment, she snatched her clipboard from the mat, her face contorting into a sneer. "This isn't over, Mr. Thorne. You have no idea what you've started." She turned and practically fled, her slight limp more pronounced as she scurried down the stone path, swallowed by the darkness beyond the light's reach. The sound of her car starting and peeling away down the street was a screech of impotent fury. I closed the door, bolted it, and leaned against the cool wood, my own adrenaline finally starting to ebb, leaving a cold certainty in its place. She was right. This was just the beginning. Karen's next move wasn't with a key or her foot. It was with whispers and poison. The takedown she was planning was far more insidious. She launched a smear campaign. Within a week, I was the community pariah. She used the community's private Facebook group and her network of coffee clatch gossips to paint me as a deeply disturbed veteran with a short fuse and two vicious, unpredictable attack dogs. She twisted my desire for privacy into antisocial paranoia. She framed my knowledge of the bylaws as the litigiousness of a troublemaker. Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Let's see how many of us there are. The atmosphere changed overnight. Neighbors who used to wave would now hurry inside when I checked my mail. I'd see curtains twitch when I took the dogs out in my new, unapproved, and now very necessary cedar-fenced yard. The air, once filled with the scent of cut grass and blooming azaleas, now felt thick with suspicion. My sanctuary had been turned into a fishbowl, and I was the strange creature everyone was watching. Then came the official escalation, a coordinated barrage designed to break me. It started on a Monday with a fine for $1,500 slid under my door for the fence. The notice cited a dozen different violations, each one more ridiculous than the last. Tuesday brought a certified letter from a high-priced law firm in Charlotte, formally threatening to place a lien on my house if the fine wasn't paid and the fence wasn't removed within 30 days. The paper felt heavy in my hand, the crisp legalese a tangible threat to the one thing I had left of my grandmother. Wednesday was the most personal. I came home from a grocery run to find my fiber optic cable, which ran along the base of the fence, had been cleanly snipped. It was petty sabotage, impossible to prove, but the message was clear. We can touch you. We can disrupt your life whenever we want. Losing my internet connection felt like being cut off from the world, the silence of the house suddenly oppressive. It was a classic isolation tactic. I sat in the growing dusk, the house smelling of the dust motes dancing in the last rays of sun, and felt a surge of cold, focused anger. This was Karen's strategy: overwhelm, isolate, and intimidate. It was the playbook of every petty tyrant, but she was treating this like a neighborhood dispute. I was treating it like an insurgency. And the first rule of counterinsurgency is to win the support of the local population. I spent the next week gathering intelligence. I started with a list of all homes in Whisperwood Estates that had been cited for violations in the past 2 years, which I obtained through a public records request of all liens filed by the HOA. Cross-referencing those addresses with public property records, I identified a pattern. The majority of fines and threats were leveled against older residents, people on fixed incomes, or new families who were too overwhelmed to fight back. I put on my most disarming face, the one I used to get scared witnesses to talk, and I started knocking on doors. Most people were too scared to speak to me, but a few, behind closed doors and in hushed tones, shared their stories. One elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, told me through tears how Karen had forced her to rip out her late husband's prize-winning rose garden because it wasn't aesthetically uniform. The scent of stale potpourri and grief hung heavy in her small, dark living room. Another young couple told me about the nightmare of getting a simple backyard swing set approved for their kids, a process that involved 6 months of bureaucratic torture and nearly $2,000 in unreceipted application fees. My breakthrough came in the form of Arthur Pendleton, a retired forensic accountant who lived 3 streets over. He was one of the original homeowners, sharp as a tack at 75, with eyes that had seen decades of cooked books. He'd been the HOA treasurer until he'd had a falling out with Karen 2 years prior over financial irregularities. When I knocked on his door, the smell of brewing chicory coffee and old paper welcomed me in. He listened to my story, nodding slowly, his face a roadmap of thoughtful wrinkles. Karen Shipley, he said, his voice a dry rustle, treats the HOA's operating budget like her own personal piggy bank. She runs this place like a dictator, using the fines to subsidize her pet projects and pay her husband's friends for overpriced contracts. The books are a disaster, but she keeps them under lock and key. He leaned forward, a glint in his eye. She bullies, she threatens, and she always hides the numbers. If you want to beat her, that's her weak point. It's always the money. Arthur became my silent partner, my secret weapon. He told me about a provision in the North Carolina Planned Community Act, my second knowledge bomb. State law for 47F 3-118 stipulated that all homeowners have the right to inspect and copy an HOA's financial records, including detailed expenditure reports and all current contracts, with reasonable notice. Most residents didn't know it existed, and Karen certainly didn't advertise it. It was a legal crowbar, and we were about to pry her lockbox open. If you think HOAs should be held accountable, type yes so we can get this trending. We drafted a formal, legally precise letter requesting a full inspection of the last 3 years of financial records. I sent it via registered mail, a move that left a paper trail she couldn't ignore. The move shifted the battlefield from her territory of gossip and intimidation to my territory of evidence and procedure. The 30-day clock on my fence violation was still ticking, but now a new clock was ticking for her. The next HOA meeting was held in the sterile, beige community clubhouse. The air was thick with the cheap scent of plug-in air freshener and palpable tension. Karen ran the meeting with her usual iron fist, but I could see the strain around her eyes. When she opened the floor for new business, I stood up. I felt like I was in a courtroom, every eye in the room on me. "My name is Jake Thorne," I began, my voice calm and carrying easily through the room. "Pursuant to North Carolina General Statute 47F 3-118, I am formally requesting to know the status of my written request to inspect the association's complete financial records, submitted 10 days ago." A murmur went through the crowd. Karen's face went rigid, her knuckles white where she gripped the lectern. "That is a board matter, Mr. Thorne, and is being handled internally," she said dismissively. "It's a homeowner's right matter," I countered, holding up a copy of the statute. "The law requires you to make those records available in a timely manner. Your refusal to do so is in itself a violation of state law. The residents of this community have a right to see how our money is being spent." This was the midpoint, the moment I thought I had her. I had the law, I had the moral high ground, and I was exposing her secrecy to her subjects. I expected her to crumble, to deflect, to postpone. I didn't expect her to have an ambush of her own waiting. She gave a small, cruel smile. This was her twist. "Speaking of the welfare of the community, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice dripping with false concern, "your aggressive and unstable animals remain a serious threat. I have here," she held up a thick sheaf of papers from her clipboard, "signed complaints from 7 of your neighbors, attesting to your dog's menacing behavior and incessant barking." My blood ran cold. It was a lie. My dogs barely ever barked. "Therefore," she continued, her voice rising triumphantly, "out of a concern for the safety of our children, I took the liberty of forwarding these complaints to the county. I was informed this morning that Animal Control has opened a formal investigation. They will be making a site visit to assess your animals. And if they are deemed dangerous, well, you know the procedure." The air was sucked out of my lungs. It was a brilliant, evil masterstroke. She had used her husband's connection to the county commissioner to bypass normal channels and trigger an immediate high-level investigation. She had manufactured evidence. She had turned my greatest strength, my disciplined, loyal dogs, into my greatest vulnerability. The fight was no longer about money or fences. She was going to have my family put down. The room was spinning. My meticulous case file, my legal strategy, it all felt like dust in my hands. She had escalated the conflict to a place where I could lose everything that mattered. If you thought they couldn't stoop lower, you're wrong. and this is where I got my payback. I walked out of that meeting in a daze, the sympathetic and hostile stares of my neighbors burning into my back. When I got home, the silence of the house felt different, fragile, breakable. I looked at Atlas and Nix, who greeted me with their usual quiet affection, oblivious to the fact that their lives were now in danger. That night, I didn't sleep. I just sat with them, my hand on their warm fur, the scent of cedar from the new fence drifting through the open window. I had to pivot. A financial audit was a long, slow war of attrition. I was now in a crisis situation. I needed a new strategy. I needed a bigger gun. The next morning, as I was desperately trying to find a lawyer who specialized in animal cases, I saw it. A plain white van from the county animal control department crawling slowly down my street. It parked across from my house, a vulture waiting. My heart hammered in my chest. This was it. But then another car pulled up behind it. A nondescript sedan. A woman with a familiar, determined face got out, a press pass hanging from her neck and a photographer in tow. It was Sarah Jenkins, a local investigative reporter I'd worked with on a cold case years ago. I had made one phone call after leaving the meeting, a desperate gambit to a number I hadn't dialed in years. Sarah saw the animal control van, then looked at me standing on my porch. She raised an eyebrow, a small, knowing smile on her face. Her photographer lifted his camera. The sound of the shutter clicking was like a gunshot marking the start of a new public battle. Karen wanted to fight me in the shadows with lies and political leverage. I was about to drag her illegal HOA tactics, and her entire corrupt enterprise into the blinding, unforgiving light. The war was no longer contained to Whisperwood Estates. It was about to be on the 6 o'clock news. The flash of the camera was a starting pistol. The animal control officer, a heavyset man named Miller with weary, seen-it-all eyes, froze on the sidewalk. Sarah Jenkins was already moving, her press pass swinging like a pendulum, her voice cutting through the tense morning air which carried the scent of wet asphalt from an overnight shower. "Sir, I'm Sarah Jenkins with Channel 8 News Investigates. We're doing a story on HOA disputes. Could you tell us why you've been called to this specific residence?" Miller blinked, caught between a disgruntled homeowner and a reporter who smelled a story. He was a public servant, not a political operative, and his discomfort was palpable. Before he could answer, I stepped forward from the porch, my hands open and visible. "It's all right, officer. Please come in." "You too, Sarah. I have nothing to hide." My voice was an invitation, calm and reasonable, a stark contrast to the narrative of a dangerous recluse. "You've been told my dogs are a menace. I'd like you to assess them for yourself." I led them inside. The house was clean, smelling of fresh coffee and a hint of the cedar from my ongoing projects. Atlas and Nix, on my quiet command, were in a perfect sit position in the middle of the living room, their tails giving a slight, curious thump, thump, thump on the hardwood floor. They didn't move, didn't bark, just watched the strangers with intelligent, focused eyes. Sarah's photographer was already working, the clicks of his camera the only sound in the room. Officer Miller stood in the entryway, his initial apprehension melting into professional assessment. "They told me you had two uncontrolled, aggressive animals," he said, his gaze sweeping over the scene. "I have 2 retired military working dogs," I corrected gently. "They're level 3 certified in obedience and patrol work." "Atlas," I said, and the Malinois' ears twitched. "Heel." Atlas rose and moved to my left side, sitting perfectly aligned with my leg. "Nix, watch!" The Dutch Shepherd's head lifted, her eyes scanning the windows and doors in a calm, practiced sweep of the perimeter. I spent the next 20 minutes taking Officer Miller through their paces. I had them track a set of keys I'd hidden in the backyard, perform off-leash obedience drills, and demonstrate their release command on a chew toy. Sarah's camera rolled the entire time. The dogs were flawless, their discipline and stability undeniable. They were the opposite of a threat. They were the embodiment of control. Finally, Miller sighed, shaking his head as he scribbled in his notepad. "Mr. Thorne, these are some of the best-trained animals I've ever seen." The complaint alleged they were lunging at the fence and barking for hours on end. "They don't bark unless I command it or there's a direct physical threat to this house," I said, like someone trying to kick the door in at 3 in the morning. I looked directly at Sarah. "And I have video of that too." Sarah's eyes lit up. The story had just gone from a simple HOA dispute to a potential criminal conspiracy. Miller, looking like a man who just realized he'd been used as a pawn, closed his notepad. "My official assessment will be no threat found. Complaint unsubstantiated. You won't be hearing from us again. Mr. Thorne, but you might be hearing from the sheriff's department about filing a false report. The news story that aired that night was a bombshell. Sarah expertly wove the narrative. The decorated veteran seeking peace, the highly trained service animals, the escalating harassment from an overzealous HOA president, and the stunning video of Karen Shipley kicking my door in the dead of night. She ended the segment by asking a simple question. If the Whisperwood Estates HOA is willing to file false reports against a former U.S. Army investigator, what might they be doing to other residents? The floodgates opened. Sarah's news station was inundated with calls. My phone started ringing with blocked numbers, neighbors finally feeling brave enough to speak. Arthur Pendleton called, his voice giddy with excitement. You flushed her out into the open, son. She's wounded. Now we go for the kill. The final piece of the puzzle, the weapon that would end the war, wasn't on the internet or in a law book. It was in the past. It was in the attic, in my grandmother's cedar chest. Driven by a hunch, I went up there, the air thick and warm, smelling of ancient wood and memories. I opened the chest, the scent of lavender and mothballs rising like a ghost, the same lavender scent Karen wore, now reclaimed by a better memory. Beneath a stack of hand-stitched quilts, I found it. Not just a ledger of her paid dues, but a heavy leather-bound portfolio. On the cover, in faded gold leaf, were the words, Whisperwood Estates, Founding Charter and Covenants. 1994. My grandmother, meticulous to the end, had saved the original, signed incorporation documents. She'd been one of the first 5 homeowners to sign them. I carried the portfolio downstairs like it was a holy relic. Arthur came over immediately, his hands trembling slightly as he opened it. We spread the crisp yellowed pages across my dining room table. For hours, we compared the original signed charter to the current bylaws Karen enforced. The discrepancies were staggering. But the smoking gun was on page 12 under Article X, amending the covenants. It stated in unambiguous terms that any amendment required a written ballot and a 75% affirmative vote from the entire homeowner population. The master key clause, I breathed, pulling out the 2008 amendment, the one she passed in an emergency board meeting. Arthur was already flipping through his own files of old meeting minutes. Here it is, he said, his finger stabbing a line on the page. June 12, 2008. Board members present, Karen Shipley, Robert Shipley, and one other who resigned a week later. Vote unanimous. It's a complete fraud. She never held a community vote. This document, he slapped the amendment, isn't worth the paper it's printed on. It's forgery. It's conspiracy. This is a criminal act. The entire foundation of Karen's power was built on a lie. Every fine she'd levied, every threat she'd made under the authority of these illegal amendments was invalid. But Arthur wasn't done. His eyes scanned the original charter, a document he hadn't seen in 25 years. He suddenly stopped, his finger tracing a paragraph. A slow, triumphant smile spread across his face. "Oh, you clever, clever woman," he whispered, speaking to my grandmother's memory. He turned the portfolio towards me. It was the third and final knowledge bomb, the kill switch I never knew existed. Article 13, Dissolution of Corporation. It stipulated that if the board of directors was found by a court or through binding arbitration to have committed an act of criminal fraud, a petition signed by just 30% of homeowners could force an immediate and binding vote to dissolve the HOA entirely. The founders had built in a self-destruct mechanism, a final check on absolute power. Your story could be next. Comment your HOA horror below, and I might cover it. We had everything. The fraudulent amendment, the financial records that showed blatant kickbacks to her husband's landscaping company, and now, the legal mechanism to dismantle her entire kingdom. We drafted the petition that night. Within 48 hours, thanks to the public outrage from Sarah's reporting, we had signatures from over 60% of the homeowners. We forced an emergency meeting. The clubhouse was packed to the rafters. The air was electric, a mixture of fear, anger, and hope. Sarah Jenkins and her camera crew had a prime spot in the front row. Karen and her husband sat at the head table, their faces pale and drawn. She tried to control the proceedings, banging her gavel for order, but her power was gone. The room was no longer hers. I walked to the podium, not with a speech, but with a file. I laid it all out. The illegal door-kicking incident. The manufactured animal complaints. The financial ledgers showing tens of thousands of dollars in no-bid contracts paid to a company owned by her brother-in-law. Then, I held up the 2008 amendment. "This document," I said, my voice ringing with clarity, "the one that grants Karen Shipley the right to a master key to your homes, is a forgery." A collective gasp went through the room. It was passed without the legally required 75% vote of this community. "It is fraudulent." I then held up the original 1995 charter. "And according to this, the legal founding document of this community, that act of fraud gives us, the homeowners, the right to do this." I placed the signed petition on the podium. "This is a petition signed by a majority of your neighbors to force a vote to dissolve the Whisperwood Estates Homeowners Association, effective immediately." It was then that Karen finally broke. All the composure, the smug superiority vanished. She leaped to her feet, her face a terrifying mask of rage. "You can't!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "I built this community. I protect your property values. I keep people like him in line. Without me, this place would be chaos. You need me." Her rant was a confession, a desperate, pathetic admission of her twisted worldview, and it was all caught on camera. Her husband tried to pull her away, but the damage was done. The vote was a mere formality. It was nearly unanimous. The Whisperwood HOA was dead. In the weeks that followed, the fallout was swift. The district attorney, spurred by the media frenzy and the mountain of evidence, launched a formal investigation. Karen and her husband were indicted on charges of wire fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement. Their manicured empire crumbled into a pile of legal fees and public shame. A month later, on a cool, clear autumn afternoon, I stood on my front porch. The air smelled of wood smoke and decaying leaves, the quintessential scent of the Blue Ridge Mountains. In my hands, I held my grandmother's wind chimes. I reached up and hung them from the same hook they had occupied for 50 years. Their first, gentle notes in the breeze were the sweetest sound I had ever heard. It wasn't just a melody. It was the sound of reclamation. The sound of peace. Nix and Atlas lay at my feet, their heads resting on their paws, basking in a sliver of warm sun. I had come here seeking a sanctuary and had found a war zone instead. But in fighting for my home, I had inadvertently liberated an entire community. We replaced the HOA with a simple voluntary neighborhood watch and a road maintenance fund. No more aesthetic violations, no more clipboard patrols, just people living their lives. My grandmother's house was finally what it was always meant to be, a home, a fortress of quiet solitude. This fight showed me that one person, armed with the truth and the will to see it through, can topple any tyrant. It proved that no one is above the law. If you believe that too, hit subscribe and let's take down every corrupt HOA together, because your home should be your castle, not their kingdom.